Gamers around the world are no doubt familiar that as a form of entertainment, video games are still very much seen as being firmly outside of the mainstream. Mindlessly violent things that exist solely to please a handful of nerds across the globe who live in their parents' basement? Well, apparently. This blinkered consensus, of course, comes despite the fact that Grand Theft Auto 5 is the most successful entertainment product in history, despite the fact that the Nintendo Wii was the hottest item of Christmas 2006, and despite the fact that everyone at some point in their lives has definitely played a mobile game. In short, it seems like there's always been this strange, unwritten rule for people that if video games are involved with something in some way, then that something shouldn't really be taken seriously. Try explaining the Game Awards or the Gaming BAFTAs to someone who doesn't consider themselves a gamer, for example, and watch their eyes glaze over and the light leave their soul. Try speaking to a film critic or English Lit student about why you think games can and should be considered art. There's a good chance they'll laugh you out of the room. Because of all this, because games are seen as such a trivial pastime, the esports scene is facing a very real and frankly ridiculous uphill struggle to get recognised as a real sport. As we're sure you've already figured out, we absolutely believe that esports are a perfectly valid and real form of sport. It's perhaps understandable that people would be less willing to accept something on the basis that it's the new kid on the block. Why should a relatively fresh game like Overwatch be taken as seriously as an established, traditional sport like rugby or football, for example? But video game competitions have actually been around since the early 70s. What many seem to recognise as the first esports event happened way back in October 1972 at Stanford University. Students competed to be the very best at a game called Space War. The winner bagged themselves a year-long subscription to Rolling Stone magazine, a hot prize I'm sure we can all agree. It wasn't until 1980, however, that the first gaming competition reared its head in the form of the Space Invaders Championships. This event had a whopping 10,000 participants and received a fair amount of media attention, given that Space Invaders was very much the Wii Sports of its day. Fast forward nearly 4 decades and gaming competitions have only gotten bigger. The power of the internet obviously helped push things along, and as gaming has carved out a bigger audience and produced grander, shinier, far more ambitious games than the likes of Space War or Space Invaders, these competitions have understandably gotten a lot more exciting to watch, thanks to games like Counter-Strike, Rocket League, and Smash Brothers. Esports competitions have undoubtedly spent most of their existence on the fringes of mainstream, with their popularity only really surging in the last couple of years. And to those who don't consider themselves gamers, it's easy to see that esports might have suddenly sprung up from nowhere. The truth is, of course, that like any other kind of sport, the esports scene has grown and changed over the years. These events certainly didn't just suddenly spring up one day out of nowhere and start selling out arenas, nor did they start to draw millions of viewers online, or attract sponsorship from the likes of Mountain Dew or Red Bull. Even ESPN now have a dedicated esports news section on their website, and this was only a year after the company's president John Skipper challenged esports legitimacy in the realm of real sports. In 2014, he said, "It's not a sport, it's a competition. Chess is a competition, checkers is a competition. Mostly, I'm interested in doing real sports." Today, the ESPN esports section is a thriving hub that reports on every facet of the scene. Just recently, the insanely popular Twitch streamer and esports star Ninja was the first of his kind to be featured on the front cover of ESPN magazine, a huge step forward for the genre. As if recognition from one of the most respected and well-known sports networks on the planet wasn't enough for you, try this on for size. In 2016 alone, esports attracted $280 million in ad spend. By 2021, it's been predicted this figure will have risen to and exceeded $1 billion. While Statista forecasts that by the end of the year, we will have watched over 6 billion hours of esports coverage worldwide. That's in 2018 alone. Whichever way you cut it, this is an industry that needs to be taken seriously. We can establish that esports has a history behind it then, and we can also establish that there are esports events that are capable of drawing in arenas full of people. Oh, and we can establish that esports is capable of making more money than I could ever have imagined in my life. So if it's not even really a question of popularity anymore, where does that leave us? Why are people still refusing to acknowledge this global phenomenon as a real sport? The truth is that esports are actually being taken seriously in some parts of the world. If you know even a little bit about the scene, then it won't surprise you to learn that a massive chunk of esports mega success doesn't actually come from this side of the globe, but from Asia. According to ESC, the international 2017 Dota 2 stream was watched by over 500 million viewers. However, if you exclude Chinese viewers, this number plummets to a little over 44 million. which speaks volumes about the popularity of esports in the East versus the West. That's not to say esports aren't popular in the West. They quite clearly are still doing exceptionally well over here, but the way they've absolutely blown up in the East is remarkable. According to research by Newzoo, Southeast Asia is the industry's fastest growing region, with over 9.5 million esports fans, a number that is apparently all set to double by 2019. Interestingly, the esports boom in Asia has very much coincided with the scene being taken up as a real sport. In places such as Singapore and Malaysia, esports academies have sprung up to help competitors really sharpen their skills. While it was announced last year that esports would become a competitive sport at the 2022 Asian Games, it's hard to say for sure whether Asia accepting esports on such a scale played a role in its surge in popularity, or if the rise in popularity is what helped it get noticed as a serious sport. Personally, I think that both are possible. Popularity fueled legitimacy, just as much as legitimacy then in turn aided popularity. This shift is something we're starting to see happen over here. In addition to the surging popularity and increased coverage from legitimate sports publications, teams like West Ham and Manchester City have signed esports stars to represent them in FIFA tournaments. Meanwhile in America, NBA teams like Sacramento Kings and the Golden State Warriors have gone so far as to put together their own pro League of Legends teams. Even 5 years ago, this kind of investment in esports from real sports would have seemed laughable. So, the sporting world is certainly taking notice, both the press and the players. So it feels safe to say that the only real pushback and reluctance to accept esports into the world of sports comes from the public. Sadly, for the most part, what it comes down to for many is that playing video games is simply not sport, because it lacks the kind of physicality we're used to seeing from stuff like sprinting, football, tennis, and cricket. So what actually defines a sport then? The most widely accepted definition seems to be this: an activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment. Esports players display incredible skill. Anyone that even tries to dispute this clearly has never watched a single second of a pro tournament. These are the kinds of players that make it look as though you've been playing video games underwater in some kind of slow motion bubble your entire life. But there are those who will point out that sitting in a chair and playing still isn't inherently athletic. This is a fair enough argument, but I'd argue darts and pool aren't inherently athletic. So why do they get to be considered real sport? I don't want to reiterate my earlier point that people just don't recognise or respect video games. But yeah, that. If esports players don't display an obvious physical athleticism, they have certainly proven they've got the dedication, mental discipline and hand-eye coordination to compete in the big leagues. Surely traits anyone would expect from an athlete. For example, ESPN not long ago had League of Legends player Eugene Park, aka Pabelta, take the Wonderlic test. This is a standard test taken by NFL draft prospects to assess their cognitive ability and problem-solving skills. Park scored 41 out of 50, beating every quarterback in the draft, despite being the only one who was not warned about the test beforehand. Meanwhile, Professor Ingo Frobose of the German Sports University studied a number of esports stars and concluded the following: the esports athletes achieve up to 400 movements on the keyboard and mouse per minute, 4 times as much as the average person. The whole thing is asymmetrical, because both hands are being moved at the same time and various parts of the brain are also being used at the same time. In addition to the motor skills required, the games require a high degree of tactical understanding for an athlete to defeat his opponent. In short, these guys and girls know what they're doing, and they are trained to be the best at it. The fact is, whether you want to accept it or not, esports are absolutely real sports. The biggest publications in the world have acknowledged it. Some of the most reputable sporting teams around are backing it, and countries are slowly but surely recognising it as an official sport, with Germany being one of the most recent to recognise esports and pave the way for its place in the Olympics. On top of that, esports players have proven they have the dedication, training and ability to be considered athletes by the most reasonable definitions. I started this video by arguing that esports aren't accepted by the majority of the public because video games still have a weird stigma around them to these same people. After looking at all the facts, I absolutely maintain that stance. Esports has been accepted on a massive scale by so many in the sporting world, and across huge chunks of the globe. Esports are officially sport, and if you genuinely disagree, it won't be long at all until you're the one in the minority. Thank you very much for watching this episode of On The Level. What are your thoughts on esports? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe to Unilad Gaming for more great gaming content.